comes to Cuba, the first consideration that we have to make is that Cuba is the only place in the world outside of Africa, or maybe even inside of Africa, that is named after an ancient African kingdom. Right? Cuba and Luba were twin cities in the Congo, pre-colonial, right? So, and the name was given to the island by influence of these Congolese travelers. So now, Africa having its name from a Roman conqueror, right?
Brother Scipio.
Yeah. Cuba is ethereally like Wakanda.
True. It feel like that too.
Right?
No, it did. I felt black power like a motherfucker.
Yo, everywhere you go, like remember even the murals that we were seeing, like everywhere you go in Cuba is black.
Yeah.
Like the essence of it is like, just for like an African American person who the only time we really see ourselves is in slave shit, you know what I'm saying? But to see ourselves, or in an isolated area of a metropolitan city, but to see representations of yourself everywhere makes Cuba such an important place, and it kind of speaks to you about the history of how these people have continued to make themselves the center of their existence.
Right.
Yeah. Even though my communication skills was limited, I felt at home.
Right, it's some
More
weird
than here,
shit.
and I speak English. And you understand what I'm saying? I felt at home, like.
Well, the thing about it is that, and that's the other thing. So, it's funny because the ultra conscious people get into. Here's my beef with people when they compare what they call miscommonly represent by calling them Santeria. People will criticize Santeria and say it is bastardized and creolized because of Spanish influence. But you never hear people criticize Haitian Vodun.
Facts. Ooh.
The Cuban Lucumí is truly void of Spanish influence. The actual songs are not in Spanish. When you get to Haitian Vodun, a lot of that vernacular is French. That's crept in that, so that means that the songs were constructed in that paradigm. These songs that they sing in the Lucumí drummings, you see evidence of the same cadences and words used in places like Brazil, right? So that some of the same songs come over, they might have a couple words changed, or a punchline changed, but they're the same songs. So that's one of the things that I noticed that people, they criticize about Santeria and Lucumí in terms of, oh well, they speak Spanish, but you don't criticize Haiti for that, right? Haitian Vodun is not seen to be less effective or pure outside of Dahomey or Benin or Togo, but somehow Lucumí is not given the same consideration in contrast to traditional Nigerian Orisha worship.
It's a good point you brought up, Padrino, because I was on Facebook and I saw they were singing a song to Obatala. And this, I guess somebody that is a continental African in Nigeria was singing to Obatala, and it was this Lucumí priest that was singing to Obatala. And the words were damn near identical. How they sang it was different, which you could say hundreds of years in different places and different influences, but the message was still the same. So even going back to the idea of creolization, like I can admit, in my journey to finding all of this, I was like, man, I don't know, do I want to go the Lucumí route, or do I just want to go to Nigeria because it's more black? I feel like Lucumí, and this is me not knowing the history of Lucumí. and just seeing the aesthetics that other cultures have assigned to Lukumi, which are normally more of the more European, like white looking Spanish countries. Because when you go into Cuba and you see those statues, like the statues we went in the store, you wasn't seeing like the statues that you see here.
No.
You see a representation
of the
people. So I think it's very important for African Americans, you know, if you're deciding to even come this route, is to learn the history of it, because the history is black as fuck.
Right. Well, see, but that's the thing. That's the other thing, though. Black history is a misnomer. It really isn't black history. It's really just whatever fragments people could afford to necessarily bring to the surface. Meaning, we wouldn't even be in this conundrum if you understood. So, going back to the whole thing about Spanish. Spanish is a derivative of Latin. And Latin is a byproduct of the Moors. And so, this is why the Latin words are very similar to some of the Lukumi words, right? And so we don't factor in. So this was a big thing that when my mother's godfather returned from living in Nigeria for 35 years, we had a discussion, he and I, and the discussion was about his regrets in changing certain things from the Lukumi system without the proper knowledge. So in the late 70s and early 80s, when African Americans became a little bit proficient within the tradition that they could start to initiate themselves, they decided to change the aesthetic of what we call the middle day clothes. This is the clothes that you wear on the day after your initiation to present to the community that you have been initiated. Now, traditionally, these clothes have a Castilian aesthetic to them. Puffy shoulders, applique, you know, the breast, you know, across the breast, buttons. So the African Americans were they were adulate to that. They thought that this was too Castilian, and so they rejected this tradition, and they sought out traditional Nigerian attire. And so 35 years later, after living in Nigeria, my mother's godfather, who is an author, Baba Lloyd Weaver, expressed to me that his regrets in them changing the clothes because they did not understand the historical implications of the clothing. And so that the clothing was there to empower the African, because the clothing represented he who was in power. And so for that day, albeit I be a slave or a layman, now I have collected my little bit of monies to go through this rites of passage, and now this day they are going to present me to my community as someone important now. And so I mimic he who has been a model of authority, who is the conquistador.
So really it is, African spirituality is African psychology.
Oh, very much so.
101.
See, these words that you have based on the Greek etymology, they fall short. Spiritualism is a therapy session. It is group therapy session.
Facts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
It's group therapy session. You get your personal therapy session in the divination, but that's still not too intimate, because it's the diviner and he or she, or what they call the ofecita, the person who is recording, the witness, right? So you're allowed to mesh over these these idiosyncrasies that you may suffer from based on these contexts. The spiritualism allows, so now this is back to Cuba. Cuba developed a system of spiritualism through outside influence. So spiritualism, it conceptually existed prior to Allan Kardec. If you get a lot of historical books about the Congo and the motifs that come out of the Congo, you will see pictures or paintings of inside the little hut, then they'll have the Nkisi, and above it, it'll be some little shelf with a glass of water and a cross. They were very, very familiar with Jesus Christ for 200 years before they were ever brought on a ship.
Facts.
So, when Allan Kardec codified it, they absorbed the good tenets of that system, and they applied it to what they understood, so that the spiritualism that comes out of Cuba, Mesa Blanca, directly affects the spiritualism that comes out of Puerto Rico. And directly affects what you see when they have the Mala Verde in places like Venezuela and stuff, where they necessarily deify drug dealers.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Right? The Malverde, that comes from the mechanism of spiritualism, because spiritualism created the mechanism of a glass of water and light, and an actual altar outside of the church, of having a statuette and it being sanctified by the priest and whatnot. No, I'm just going to necessarily wash my glasses out, and I'm going to say some prayers and dedicate this space to them. This is a Cuban construct. Now, I would be lying to say that I'm all the way familiar with how this concept traveled. I will give some credence to the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal at that time was an exchange of a lot of Caribbean people. And, Caribbean people may not have had the same structural mechanisms as Cuba had with Lucumí, but they understood to go see the Juju man, the Obeah man, right? The root man.
Two-head doctor.
Okay, so you go see this person, and so when they went to places like Panama where they were interacting with these different customs, it gave credence because in context, when they talk about Palo, right? And they speak about the brujos. They don't really talk about the Angolans and the people that came from Congo as being really the brujos. The ones who they necessarily give this identification to is the people from like the Canary Islands and places like Cape Verde and all of these places. This is where they were like, their witchcraft was really, really good. Because these people were constantly coming in contact with travelers. And so their magic was good because they pick up a whole bunch of stuff. So this is where the phrase Santo Tomás ve para Acre. St. Thomas, the island, is where like the worst slaves were sent. And these were the dudes that you couldn't really do nothing to them because these niggas they were warlocks. You put these niggas in the cell and they come back and they gone. What the fuck they gone? These niggas on the roof and shit. Like, what are you gonna do with these niggas, right? So that concept of Santo Tomás or in St. Thomas, you believe it when you see it. You talking that shit till you see one of these niggas get out that chains and he fly away. Because there's recordings of that. There's a book called Diaries of a Runaway Slave by Esteban Montenegro.
Got it downstairs.
In that book, he talks about what he saw from the slaves. And he's not an initiate. That's what makes the book so profound. He's not a Lukumi initiate. He's not a Palomayombe initiate. He just tell you what he's seen the other Africans around him doing. And he talks about how on the 3 legs of the cauldron, the Congolese would make the pot walk down the barracoons. Or they would wait and see the master walk down or the overseer walk down the road on the horse, and they would take the dirt that the horse walked on and they would put it in their pot. And they would take the pots and put the pots on the porch and dare the overseer to come outside for the day. That's how they would get days off. They would do witchcraft, put the cauldron on the porch and dare the overseer come outside. I guarantee you die today. Okay? So they became most proficient and known for their protests. When here in America, when we look at what's commonly known as bed warmers, bed warmers is guerrilla warfare by Congolese women. I'm gonna poison this woman, this white Miss Ann is always sick in this.
She's always
in the slave movie, right? Because they've been feeding her, so they're like, they're gonna kill this bitch nice and slow, right? So I got this leaf that you keep eating it, you're gonna die. So I give it to her for breakfast. I give it to her for lunch till she got this fever and this cough, right? And she can't get rid of it, right? And when she dies, he's gonna come out to the barracoons and pick on somebody new. And it's her job now to tell him what to do.
Yep.
Right? This is Congolese guerrilla warfare. Right? So, back to Cuba. Cuba is important because Cuba set the tone for the codification of the tradition. Right? Because there was no codification, because remember, these traditions and this science was not codified in Africa. It was a locale informational tool. People from the locale necessarily knew how to work certain orishas, right? The Cuban paradigm forces them to codify this thing, to come up with a system, to look at the entire map and see what is the connectivity of each thing. Okay? So that the rituals that come out of Cuba are very are actually the most ancient. The other issue is that they're now coming to grips with. Well, let me just say this. A lot of these New Age scholars and Yoruba scholars, they be paying attention and they don't give credit where credit is due. Right? So, for a long time, the misnomer was that Lukumi was a fragmented concept of what was happening in Africa, and they had forgotten some things and they could only put together what they could remember. And so Lukumi was this bastardized version of Orisha traditions in the Americas.
Right.
But now we find out that there is a province in Yoruba land named Olukumi.
Right.
Who gets its uniqueness from the fact that it is a culmination of migrants from all other Yoruba cosmopolitan areas as well as the surrounding areas around that. So that Olukumi is said to have had some Congo influences in it, some Dahomian influences, some Togo influences, Cameroon influences, Ile Ife, Oyo, so that the common misnomer that this system of Lukumi was somehow set up here in Americas is actually a misinterpretation. That these customs that come out of Cuba come from a particular locale in Yoruba land where this is what these people did. The idea that the Lukumis particularly were sought after says something about the information that these people were handling and how important it was to the destabilization of Africa and the colonialization that came thereafter. right? So that there is something to say about the fact that we have a crowning ceremony in our Ocha rituals, which denotes royalty, which means that there may have been a coup d'etat in terms of the power structure in early Africa during the time that we were brought over here.
Oh, whoa.
Oh, I say.
No. I'm definitely saying that. I'm definitely giving him his props. But I'm like, you about to open up a can of worms.
No, I mean, because the reality is that in Ghana is the only place that has a slave castle
That's a fact,
on the continent
though.
of Africa.
But this is the shit that we have to talk about, because we have this romanticized, as African Americans, we have this romanticized view of Africa, that it is only the white man's influence as to why we are the way we are. But that's what I'm saying. Like, that's why spaces like this are important, to be able to clear things up about what may have happened and transpired in Africa, and why Cuba is so important is because we took the best of what we had and we took it and we mixed it together and essentially made this gumbo for us to be able to have sustenance here. For us to be able to forget the bullshit that we was doing that was tearing us apart, that allowed somebody to be able to come in, but to bring all those elements in for us to survive.
Well, that's interesting, because now you bring up the concept of what they call the 7 African powers. Right? Siete Potencia los Africanos. It's a concept that 7 major tribes sat down on an undisclosed date and came to a truce about the future of African people in this new world. In this truce, they came up with the structure for the proliferation of their traditions and rituals, so that there was a conversation that said, okay, if a child is to be initiated, the first stage of rites of passage is through Congo.
Fact.
Right? And from Congo now, albeit you receive these deities and that deity until you prepare to go on to Ocha, which then prepares you again to go on to either a drumming society, or Ifa, a divination society, or into the industries that it takes to proliferate the tradition, which is the women doing the sewing the clothes, beating the attributes, cooking the foods, right?
So do you think, because like America is very different geographically, we have so many different, we have super cold climates, super hot climates, we have all of these different elemental things that are going on here. Based on, if I came from Ile-Ife in Nigeria, I wouldn't understand how a certain type of energy would work.
Sure.
So the fact that they were smart enough to understand, like, okay, Congos, y'all be in the Ndoki, y'all be in the forest, so y'all understand that forest magic. We got some forests here, so how about you give us some of that so we can figure this shit out. So like, we have to give credit where credit is due, and I think that is disrespectful. And even with myself, like, I was very disrespectful to think that the Cuban influence had nothing to do with the African American experience. And I think that we have to clear up these misconceptions about why Cuba is so important and who were the people, the purveyors of the culture, and how they did it, and make that common knowledge. Because oftentimes people are going over, they're flying over Cuba to go to Nigeria to get something that they don't. And I got friends who have Nigerian Ocha. I'm not saying anything about it, but the friend that I know that has Nigerian Ocha, their roots tie directly to Nigeria. Like, she can go back and tell you where her family was in Nigeria. So I understand that. But for people who we were brought here all through Cuba in the transatlantic slave trade, we're directly tied and connected to Lukumi Ocha.
Well, you're directly tied to Lukumi Ocha due to the fact that they didn't take Africans from a vast place in Africa. They took Africans from specific nations. Ghana bought their way out. They was like, all right, well, we'll let you set up this castle and you can bring them through here. Just don't take our people. Because in the beginning, some of their peoples got brought in the early days. So that you find Ghanaian culture in places like Suriname, Panama, Jamaica, right?
New York too, right?
And well, yeah, in the African burial grounds of New York, and in some places like in Ohio and things of that nature, right? So what happens is the Cuba and its design spiritually. So here we are today as African Americans talking about traditions that come out of Africa. That didn't happen without Cuban influence.
Facts.
Particularly through the music. So when jazz becomes proliferated in, let's say, the early parts of the 20th century, right? The early 1900s, jazz becomes something. Jazz directly gets its syncopation from Jelly Roll Morton, who was Caribbean, who spent time in Cuba, who understood the clave and inserted it into the jazz experience, which it became the metronome for and the timekeeper for jazz.
Shout out to New Orleans.
That jazz directly affected, reverberated, and came back and affected Cuba. That it gave them something else to expound on the rumba and turn into Latin jazz. That Latin jazz projected a man by the name of Chano Pozo to the United States by way of Dizzy Gillespie. Chano Pozo brought Braciella, Machito, Mongo Santa Maria. He brought those people here. Because of them being here, they directly went back to Cuba and asked to have a babalao sent to New York for them. They originally asked for a famous babalao by the name of Quentin Lecombe. Quentin Lecombe turned down their offer. He says, I'm not supposed to go. He said, but I'll send my godson. And so he sent Pancho Moro, Ifa Morote, the first babalao. That came by way of Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie. Okay? That opened the doors for people like Robert Farris Thompson to write the books to incite African Americans to search out their culture. Okay? So, cultural consumption. What do we as Americans consume culturally? Right? We consume everything around us. So, just 2 minutes ago, we was listening to Supercat. Neither you are from the Caribbean directly, right? Away from a generation or so away from it. But as an African American, we have embraced the Caribbean cultural scene. We've made it a part of being black in America, so that you could put on reggae and I know how to conduct myself in such environment. Right? Because I am black, and so I culturally identify with that some way, somehow. The same way Dominicans culturally identify with reggaeton and hip hop and trap music. The other day I was in the Dominican barbershop and they literally was playing Dominican trap music. Like, I'm talking about like the same way that the young boys talk, where they was talking the same way, but they were talking in Spanish. Dímelo. Que lo que eso. Like the same boppity babe, the baby in them, they were doing it in Spanish because they identify culturally with the blackness, right? So cultural consumption, it is important for us to culturally consume lukumi from the perspective of the Cuban and then expound on it. See, so you have to champion first how it's given to you first. before you can necessarily put your twist on it.
Right.
So we have, so what happens is, before we can even get to the Dominicans doing reggae tone, we first had to necessarily experience the Panamanians. So during the time of Shabba Ranks, they have Dembo, 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 right? And then out of Panama came to the gas gangway, to the way, to the gas gangway, and then we didn't know what the fuck they were saying, but it was to the cultural rhythm and frequency, and so we allowed it to be reggae and dancehall without even knowing what the fuck was being said, because we culturally identify with it, right? So that is the consumption of us culturally. Now, you see the cultural consumption in the acquisition of these traditions by Mexicans,
Venezuelans,
right?
Yeah.
The fact that they are now, you can go into their botanicas and Django statue, he gonna look Mexican. He look mestizo, right?
Yeah.
And there's no fault in that, because it is the aspiration that you should want your God to look like you.
Psychology.
Exactly. But there is some racism in that for them being taught that, because essentially that's what makes the Cuban so very, very unique. Is no matter how white of a Cuban he is, he does not deny that his gods are black.
That's a fact. That is a fact.
So he uses the blackness to denote the divinity in them. Nah, them motherfuckers got the dark skin, right? And so they recognize Mammy as a cultural icon, right? Because Mammy is black and overweight, but she's wise, and she's calm, and she's all-knowing, and so they celebrate those parts of that archetype. They embrace it. We see it as a detriment. So this is how Mammy has come and turned into Precious. Because we don't embrace and love her for being overweight, and for necessarily being a constant, and for being calm, and for taking care of the domestic part that has been all but abandoned in our homes.
That's a fact.
Right? So that there is a dynamic even within Ocha in terms of how Yemonja and Oshun are, how they take care of the household. Yemonja fills in where Oshun can't. When Oshun is too busy being a fly girl and don't have the patience for the children and doesn't have the wherewithal and the know-how, Yemonja steps in. So this gives us an indication that young mothers should not be raising children by themselves. Forget just a man. There should be a mother, an aunt, a sister, a brother, a cousin, a grandparent, somebody to assist.
The extended family.
Exactly. So that you're really supposed to be able to have a baby and then drop it off at the family house.
That's how I grew up.
Right? But what happens is we haven't addressed some of the monsters in the family house. So who's necessarily been done wrong? In Cuba, they are very, very aware of the monsters in the society, so that they necessarily address it. Like Alberto, you know what it is when you come in and they like, yo, that's my brother Alberto. Don't bother him. He'll bother you. They let you know. Don't let the kids who bother him. He's snappy. It's out there in the open. They don't have him in the back room.
So with that knowing about all its aspects of living, they've adapted that into their culture, and it would behoove African Americans for us to look at those babies in the closet, those things that we don't talk about, those elephants in the room, for us to be able to have an idea of our culture and to be able to recognize the good and the bad.
Well, yeah, we have to and
put it in its place.
We have to own it.
And if we take Lukumi as a template, after we've done that inventory and we take it as a template and we live those tenets that are actually inside of Lukumi and consume those in our lives, that we can live differently and we can function.
Well, the Lukumi is only going to give you identification and context to what you see every day. See, that's the thing. Lukumi don't offer necessarily to put a hand over it and everything become rainbows and unicorns. It necessarily offers the fact that I give you context so that you know what you're dealing with, so you know how to deal with it.